Hey Mike, it's Levi, and I am recording this video as a part of the Creative Commissions package that you purchased from me, and also because I think it is owed to you regardless for giving me the great honor and the privilege and the opportunity um, to write what this piece, which I have titled Rolling for Initiative, came to be. I think that it is I think that it takes a lot of trust to give someone the kind of detailed information that you were willing to give me about yourself, about your wife, about your relationship. And I hope and pray, especially in light of not being able to get it to you mid month by your proper wedding day, um, that it is something that you both love very much. I had a lot of fun with this one. I don't often get commissioned by folks who are in love with fantasy and sci-fi and D&D and nor who are able to articulate their sort of positions and beliefs in this life in the way that you were able to. And so, at multiple times during our dialogue, you apologized for maybe writing too much or getting on a rant or something like that. And as I'm sure you'll find through this video, I am just like that. When it comes to the Enneagram, I saw that you were a 2-wing 1 and your wife is a 1-wing 9. Well, I am a 9-wing 1 and my wife is a 1-wing 2. So we are just the very closely related and yet exact opposites of both of your numbers on that grand scale of a thing that it has been. It's certainly been helpful in my marriage, and I hope that it proves to be so for you guys as well. So, what you'll see here is a poem, and there is also a demo audio recording of the poem as of right now. Like I told you, the actual final piece and mix and release, whether as a single or as a part of kind of like a compilation that would end up being released and promoted as a Levi the Poet kind of thing, will come a little bit later on down the line whenever that all gets organized. Rest assured that is still a part of this whole package that you have purchased. And for the time being, though, I just wanted to do a quick walkthrough on the poem in this way. You'll see in the way that I have delivered this to you through an application that I'm just growing more and more in love with called Notion, that I have highlighted different sections of the poem in order to call specific reference to your attention in relation to the information that you gave me and wanted integrated into it. And so when this is kind of the way that I deliver these things. And so the link will remain with you just in case. I always tell people, hey, copy paste this stuff. If you want to grab it all and put it elsewhere where you know that you've got a handle on it, fantastic. And I know that you'll have a physical version of this coming your way as well before too awful long. So I'll have to get your physical mailing address and all of that and make sure that comes and is on its way to you. But without further ado, I will just start to dive into this thing. So the opening line, my dove, you guys mentioned meeting over or loving the correspondence story. And so I thought that I would take the opportunity to call attention to that, have it be something that is reminiscent. And then you wanted the kind of crux of this story to deal largely with patience, perseverance, that maybe even suffering that produces the endurance that Scripture speaks of. And so I tried to do that in a couple of different ways. One of them, just off the bat, is to say, my dove, out here on these seas where there is no wind to speak of, and love becomes a waiting game. So I wanted to call attention to that nautical story that you guys both enjoy. Thank you very much. And also to draw a correlation between it and your desired subject matter in here because you need waves to move something along. And it sounds as though there have been seasons in your life, if not both of your lives, where it felt as though there was no wind to push you anywhere and you were stuck in a sort of limbo, at least from what I was able to gather, given the time that you spent between meeting and reconnecting, and that year and the 5th year during the college season, and all of those kinds of things, and what kind of love toward God that produces, that you said that produced inside of you, a kind of stripping away of other idolatrous things, perhaps, and a redirection of sight onto who He is. And so love becomes a waiting game. Well, we were chainmail miniatures rolling for initiative, and I certainly did my fair share of research about Dungeons and Dragons. I am sad to say, especially after that research, that I have not yet played myself, but who knows? Maybe it's in the cards for me at some point, thanks to you. But you'll see little glimpses throughout. So chainmail miniatures, rolling for initiative, a funny thing, and I made a note of it here, but when me and my friends used to tour on our Christmas runs, we would do a digital rolling for initiative to decide who was going to play first and second and third. And so I at least knew that much about what those D&D dice are. Anyhow, player characters in some divine campaign. I liked the idea of taking the player character role from D&D and then putting it into a divine campaign, which is to say this sort of overarching narrative that we believe that we're a part of in a gospel story. Battling monsters like crawling things, like apathy and time. So you mentioned that your wife hates bugs and that you hate apathy. And in reference to both of those things, crawling and apathy, also time. And I tried to make it so that apathy was not just one in a list of two, but to where apathy and time are crawling things, which is sort of a reminiscent of chapter 8 in Correspondence of Fiction, where the dad realizes that apathy has snuck into him over time. He has found that he drifted, and that's where that line about how drifting is a deeper threat than betrayal comes from, because it is truly a creeping, crawling thing that sort of slowly makes its way into you without you necessarily realizing it. So I sat and identified a shadow that I once believed was cast over me. So you spoke of recognizing and discovering depression as a recurring theme in your life during that time. There's also a sort of spiritual tradition that speaks of the way that we are all sort of darkened by our shadow selves, and we need to be able to come face to face with that person in order to move past him or her or it. And so that's where the idea of the shadow coming out from me instead of just being cast over me comes from. So we move into a mask made of the haze that was my past, and here is where the shadow self idea comes from. Spiritual maturity is to become aware that we are not the persona or the mask that we have been presenting to others. We must become intentional about recognizing and embracing our shadow. Religion's word for this is quite simply forgiveness. Reminiscent of Keep Forgiving, some of the other artwork that you've seen come from me. I faced giants and dragons and every phantasm raised. Some more game references there. On the mast of my own unconscious ship sailing, wherever the wind and waves happened to toss my frame. Like when I met her, she became the field worth any price. And here, that's reminiscent of the man in scripture who goes and sells all that he has to obtain a field. And I chose that analogy because you seem to say that before you were able to wed this woman, you needed to be able to see Christ as the field worth any price before her, which would give you the opportunity to love her more, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was trying to figure out a good way to tie all of this together. And that's where I decided to say that is an apt and romanticized but arcane, which is a kind of magic. If I have done my, it's a kind of carnal magic that exists outside of the divine or sort of spiritual realm, at least in my analogy. And so her as the field worth any price is but an example of something that points beyond itself to the Christ as the field worth any price. So I knew that life precedes death, but not the death precedes life. Her silence is crucifixion, 365 stripes. The idea there being that we each in our own way take up our cross and suffer and experience long suffering. And so that 365 stripes line is in reference to the full year that you didn't much hear from her before you were able to go through that and come back again, which, were it not for the time spent in isolation, or the bitter hand of devastation, or the letters penned in separation. So 2 references there. Bitter hand of devastation, you mentioned erring more toward a kind of Calvinistic theology. I made a reference in here for you to check out if you feel so inclined, but Piper, in a commentary that he has called A Sweet and Bitter Providence on the book of Ruth, speaks of the bitter hand of God against us in order to flatten and then resurrect who we are. So that's one part of it. And then the letters penned in separation is an obvious ode to the correspondence story. Were it not for the darkest nights, I'd have never found the light. My life. I could play board games until the end of the age and find new corners of God in your eyes. The grief observed my wife as the way that parts of him died when I thought that I'd lost you to time. That damned heavy hand of burden that seems to lift with you at my side. So this whole reference is in relation to the way that parts of our personalities, parts of who God has made us to be, come out in ways that they wouldn't otherwise were it not for the other people in our lives who draw them out. So, for instance, when C.S. Lewis wrote A Grief Observed and spoke of the way that his wife died, he didn't just say that his wife died, but also that parts of his friends died. Because only his wife was able to pull out the aspect of their personalities that he was now missing because of her absence. And so I took that to its furthest conclusions in relation to the way that aspects that your wife shows you aspects of God that you would not otherwise see of him because of her. And so there's a quote that I pulled from that Lewis book that says, I must look for my identity somehow, not only in God, but in other men or women or wives. I will never be able to find myself if I isolate myself from the rest of mankind as if I were a different kind of being. That's actually a Merton quote. And so in this case, in God and in other women. So that's connecting the dots between a previous note in the written version of this that I made about Lewis's conclusions and then Merton's understanding of the inherent God-likeness in each of us that unites us to one another. Roll the dice. Once for you spoke about falling in love in mind, body, and soul. So here we've got once for mind, twice for soul, thrice for body, buried and resurrected, like behold, all that is shattered will be made whole. So even in those moments of angsty and devastating waiting, it will be made whole. So till death do us part, my friend, I beg of you, let not death be the end. There will be 1,000-fold of them before we find ourselves back home. I think this goes back to the idea of that there's a saying, especially in kind of more Eastern Orthodoxy, that says there is a death that leads to death and there is a death that leads to life. And that idea in a sort of heaven on earth kind of way is that we must die to that sort of egoic and sinful, shadowy part of us, which sometimes I think looks more like acceptance than suppression, in order to kind of get to a place where we are fully alive. You see that in baptism, in the death beneath the water, and the resurrection, in order to receive this gift of life abundance. No people find each other more absurd than lovers, which is a quote from The Great Divorce, which you mentioned your wife is reading. And I took bits and pieces of that for this whole next section and included a link that you can read a little bit more about the ideas that I wanted to pull into this stanza there. You pull me outside of myself where hell becomes heaven when I let go of the last illusion, which is the need to feel loved. And without doing a whole full-blown exegesis on where that comes from, because it's actually a Margaret Atwood quote, the woman who did, it's so popular right now. I'm spacing it. But Brennan Manning, who is, man, if you haven't read The Ragamuffin Gospel, I would highly recommend that. But he quotes it in there and basically speaks about how we need to, how love happens when we love for the sake of it, not for what we receive from it. And so you move on to exchanging it for a thou, like she has become a person inherently worthy of love, regardless of what you stand to receive from her, and vice versa. Hold my hand, Galway girl, dance with me. You mentioned a few different Irish bands that your wife loves, and that was one of the songs written by one of them. And then I wanted to figure out how I could integrate sections of what Galway, Ireland is like. And so that's this next section, like, hold my hand, dance with me. We're fantasies stepping on one another's toes through harbor cities, stone-clad cafes and boutiques, pardon me, along the Latin Quarter, tavern hopping in Cayley. Cayley is a kind of Irish dance, celebrating Shop Street, which is the main street that goes through Galway. And raising our voice with the Dubliners, mourning the rare old times. I loved what you had to say about empathy, and so I kind of spun that into this whole idea of having a drink with some Irishmen and meeting others where they are. That what is theater if not empathy? What is empathy if not another pint raised to the pub sing? My life is a perfect graveyard of buried hopes, which is a Anne of Green Gables quote. Wherein she sort of, I actually, in that instance, I think that can be taken a couple of different ways. One of them is the sort of patient endurance that it takes to get to a place where those hopes actually die and are buried like a seed, which Jesus says must happen in order for it to come back to life. So beneath a tombstone in Green Gables, her fiction like love notes. So Tombstone Love Notes is chapter 2 from Correspondence. So that's a couple little references there. Still speaks to truths pregnant inside of my soul, like suffering only produces these things when the ghost can let go. And the ghost is, again, another reference to The Great Divorce. It is a person in that book, a character who doesn't let go. And so her suffering doesn't lead to perseverance. She still cuts her feet on the grass of whatever that heaven is that is hell to her, because she has not yet let go. And so it is sort of a coexisting state of heaven and hell, depending upon your perspective. And union does not equal sameness, which is something that I think is worth remembering when it comes to a marriage, and also a point of note in Lewis's work, where he points out that otherness is implied in creation, and it is necessary for the possibility of love. God caused things to be other than himself, that, being distinct, they might learn to love him and achieve union instead of sameness. And I cannot know what I cannot know, but your grounding astounds me. That was one of the things that you said that you loved about your wife's Christ-likeness, her grounding. And I think that that's just a good gift that God gives to wives for men, because that's also something that I love about mine. My love out here in this space when there is no air to speak of, and you take my breath away. Well, we are misborn world singers with life on our tongues, storytellers in some divinely profane myth. And I really hope that I didn't screw this part up, because that whole sci-fi series that you're reading right now is a whole other ball game that I don't know enough about. But I did put in a good amount of research to try to get to a place of understanding. And it seems as though everyone in that world, or at least some of the main characters, are mistborn, and some might be good and some might be bad. But the world singers were interesting to me because they preserve knowledge for the sake of peace. And they also preserve not just knowledge, but in a couple of places it said more specifically like religion and academia and tradition for the sake of peace. And so I thought, well, you talk about storytelling, your fascination with science, with paying forward this divinely magnificent creation and design, and you've got life on your tongue, the same way that a mistborn world singer might pay it forward to others for the sake of their peace. I liked the idea of placing divine and profane right next to one another. It's reminiscent of Martin Luther's description of believers as simultaneously saint and sinner, simul justus et peccator. Speak to me of goodness and justice and mercy. You talked about how those things created awe inside of you. Particularly in light of sin and fallenness, that I may laugh, think, and weep. And those are the marks of a good day and a full and abundant life that you described based upon the quote by the basketball coach in the 70s, for joy and for sorrow and for life. So basically, that would be where the weeping comes from, for joy and sorrow and life abundant, as this is what a full day represents. And not just that, but these things through what Scripture calls the wife of your youth, that you may delight in her, that you may find this goodness, justice, mercy, laughter, thought, weeping, joy, sorrow, and life. With this ring wed, I bind myself to thee. And that's that, man. I hope you like it, and I look forward to getting to share it with you soon.